Welcome, everyone. Peace to those near and far to open up this space and this event. We are going to hear a musical offering from Rabbi Shir Meira Feit. Rabbi Shir is a composer and spiritual guide living in the Hudson River Valley.
Razanda Dahunahar Nahar Nangin Vnafik Lapaskan Memoy Almin Razada Dahunahar Nahar Nangin Vnafik Lapaskan Memoil Almin Ve'aldami Baile Varnash Delayafsik Nahara Umkora Delay Behai Alma Ve'aldami Baile Varnash Delayafsik Nahara Umkora Delay Behai Alma Did-I Ve'aldami Baile Varnash Delayafsik Nahara Umkora Delay Behai Alma.
Thank you, Shir. And thank you for all of you for joining us tonight. I'm Eden Pearlstein, the co-founder at Iron Press, and it is a deep pleasure and honor to introduce this event celebrating the publication of Jay Michaelson's first book of short stories, The Secret That Is Not a Secret, a provocative work of Kabbalah-heretical psychedelic erotica. As a longtime friend and follower of Jay's prolific creative output, it has been particularly gratifying to help bring this new chapter of Jay's work into the world. Thank you, Jay, for entrusting Iron Press with your vision and your craft. The Secret That Is Not a Secret invites the reader into a hidden world of faith, desire, transgression, and revelation. The inhabitants of its interlocking stories are pious and rebellious, mystical and queer, from a Hasidic woman tormented by her husband's long beard to a closeted gay man repenting of his sins in the mikva. This first book of fiction by Rabbi Dr. Jay Michaelson, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, The Secret That Is Not a Secret, is a remarkable work of mystical fiction. Jay Michaelson is a writer, journalist, meditation teacher, and rabbi, and overachiever. He is the author of 10 books, most recently, The Secret That Is Not a Secret. Jay's previous book, The Heresy of Jacob Frank, From Jewish Messianism to Esoteric Myth, won the 2022 National Jewish Book Award. As a journalist, Jay regularly appears on CNN and in Rolling Stone, The Daily Beast, The Forward, and a host of other publications. Jay won the 2023 New York Society for Professional Journalists Award for Opinion Writing. Jay definitely has a lot of opinions. For 10 years, he worked as an LGBTQ activist and is the author of the best-selling God vs. Gay, The Religious Case for Equality. Jay is also a meditation teacher in Buddhist and Jewish traditions and serves on the leadership team of the New York Insight Meditation Center. Dr. Michaelson, is a public fellow at American Jewish University and a field scholar at the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality. He holds a PhD in Jewish thought from Hebrew University, a JD from Yale Law School, and a non-denominational rabbinic ordination. He lives outside New York City. Jay this evening will be in conversation with Jericho Vincent to discuss the book and other relevant secrets. Jericho Vincent is the founder and spiritual leader of Temple of the Stranger, a mystical community rooted in Jewish ancestral wisdom and open to all. They teach Torah on Instagram at the Aleph and as a guest of communities around the country. They are the author of the acclaimed memoir Cut Me Loose and an illustrated book of ancient magical Jewish tales, Legends of the Talmud. Jericho's writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Cut, The Rumpus, Salon, The Forward, Catapult, The Daily Beast, and elsewhere. They have been named the Jewish Week's 36 Under 36 and the Forward 50 for their work. Jericho lives in Brooklyn, New York with their partner, children, and Ziz and Griffin, 2 cats named for the mighty magical bird beast creatures of Jewish and Greek mythology. Jay and Jericho, please.
Thanks, Eden. And thank you, Shir, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you so much to everybody who's here. I was like looking at the Zoom grid and seeing a lot of old friends and new friends. It really means a lot to me. Thank you for taking time and being here. I am going to do a very short reading of an excerpt of one of the stories, and then Jericho, hand it over to you. Does that sound right? All right. So this story is called The Transfiguration, and it's about a kind of neo-klezmer musician in Brooklyn who has been struggling for some time and has a revelation and a transformation that takes place during a performance. And so there's a little bit, it's this last bit is the end of that story. And so there's some references to earlier in the story, but who cares about that? I'm just going to give it over as a little bit of a performance, and here we go. And then something happened. After the earthquake and the fire, Gabriel heard in David's playing a delicate, quivering voice saying 2 words only: let go. And with these words, Gabriel Frutiger experienced his own death. He was still alive, indeed somehow more alive, still standing on the side of the stage at Marian's, but the spotlight, though still on the kid, seemed to surround him. He released into the music in a way he never had before, letting it suffuse him, envelop him, surround and fill him. It was David, of course, but David is a pipe for the divine flow, the shefa raining down from the supernal realms, but at the same time entirely here, imminent and immediate. The sound in this room heard by these people, this breath, these patterns arraying themselves like the sparkling hechalot in the blinding fog of the stage lights. And Gabriel at last entered his body, bathed in music, seeing the sounds at last, somehow able by grace to set down a weight he had been carrying for 20 years. There dropped for a moment the yearning for more. This was enough, Gabriel knew. This was it. And as Gabriel let David's music inside of him, he wept because it had unlocked him, revealed what had always been true but had somehow been kept from him beyond a hidden portal. He wished to receive and surround and make a womb for this sound while also resting in the womb of the sound. There was no dichotomy of male and female anymore. There was womb and seed intermingled. There was a transfiguration into multiples, Gavriel, Gavurat El, Gavira, Gavurat Ella, Gavriel Elah, the female-male neitherness of the goddess, entering and entered, compassionate and boundaried, the Kruvim and intercourse above the ark, a multiplicity multiplying, each already complete without dichotomy, two seas intertwining without division, an interpenetration of winter, summer, moon, and earth, ocean, heart. And as if by the river Chabar, the spirit entered into Gavriel Elah, as it is written, and Gavriel beheld the world without their music. The wells of production and insemination at last run dry, and yet there was no barrenness. The world went on exactly as before, perhaps with one sonata less, but neither more nor less filled with pain or solace or rapture. It doesn't actually matter, Gavriel Elah felt. I am enough without these tones. There is no mark one needs to make. This is a man's myth, not mine. Wrapped in someone else's sublimated progenitor, it was never mine. It is over. There is already river in the sky and fire in the earth. There is already all that needs to be done. And with this, Gavriel Elah saw the sound of their own soul quieted, no longer grasping and incomplete, no longer yearning for some exterior consummation. The candle was extinguished, and yet everything was brighter than before. David's music, the light, the body which felt earthy and inflamed, and also like a chrysalis ready to be emerged from. Gavriel Elah felt the weight of this flesh as they never had before, felt its lacks and superfluities, knew that they were both ocean and vessel. At once the voice fell silent, and there was no need for secrets lying beneath or above. This was enough. Gavriel Elah was enough, because the burden was set down, done as what needed to be done. And here were these sounds and people and lights, and Gavriel Elah, the pillar of Asherah, stone tree, sky mother, deep chasm, earth father, receiving David's radiant and glowing light as if anointed in oil everywhere in the body. And in this way, Gabriel experienced death. Suddenly, it was time to play. The kid had finished. There was, for a moment, a pause as Gabriel's voice had fallen silent, but then a different voice spoke. The sound of the bat kol, at once line and cycle, right and left, and thus neither and both together, and it replied, "You are a manuscript of a divine letter." And no one in the band or the audience had before heard the kind of notes that emerged from Gavriel Elah's trumpet, which seemed to somehow expand and enclose simultaneously. They were broken and repaired. They needed nothing and thus were able to open the gate in a new way, which we have only barely merited to hear in our days, but which one day, Gavriel Elah, you will play for the Anointed One.
Thank you, Jay, for that radiant excerpt. It's just so captures the richness that this book is suffused with. It's really an honor to be with you on this momentous day. On one hand, the secret that is not a secret is so extraordinary, so pioneering. It has these revolutionary, capital T truth, mystical teachings, and they're presented in a super clear and compelling way. And then on the other hand, this book is a delicious read. Like, it's the kind of book when you've had a really long, difficult day and you just want to curl up with something really good. This is that book. It's like candy for the brain. And having written a book that is that delicious is its own accomplishment. And having written a book that contains that much truth is its own accomplishment. The fact that you managed to do both of those in the same volume is truly extraordinary. So Yasher Koach, congratulations on this extraordinary achievement.
Thank you. I'm blushing on the inside and the outside.
And I'm curious, it feels like the ideas in this book, even the characters and some of the plots, could have also lived in theological, even academic essays. Why did you decide to present the world as fiction?
Thanks for that. Yeah, and I'm kind of like, I just want to fan person back at you, because I felt the same with your work, that there's this compelling story and also this beautiful language that's telling often some really difficult, painful truths, and also at the same time in this way that it's ennobling because of the power of the language. So I'm just fan personing back. Yeah, folks who know me know, this is book number 10, and there have been 7 of nonfiction and 2 of poetry. And I've been pondering, like, do I have a theology that wants to be written in that format? And it just felt, in a way, first, I mean, I guess a little bit about the gestation of this book. Like, this preceded most of those books. I'd had an early draft of these stories, very, very different from the current version, almost 20 years ago. And then I put it down for a while and picked it up again for my MFA thesis at Sarah Lawrence, put it down again. And it wasn't resolving. The characters they were more trapped. I think there's like a tension in the book constantly, right? Body, spirit, real, unreal, visible, invisible. And yet, I don't know that I had a way to write through that tension. And so instead of a tension, it was a trap. And like, it almost wasn't interesting. And conversely, to kind of be like, well, here's my path through the wilderness, also didn't feel as real as these hopefully diverse kinds of characters just existing in different manifestations of some of those tensions. And a little bit was the cliche of, show, don't tell, that there was a way to kind of enact this in story that just wasn't alive in written theology. So maybe that's it, but these characters took control. And I remember when like some of the keys to some of their self-imposed and other imposed prisons showed up, it was like I received them also. And even in that story, actually, the one that I just ended, it had a very different ending, in the first versions. That was sort of a violent ending and an ending of being trapped. And I don't think I even had space in the imagination at that time for what liberation could look like for that character.
Yeah, I think that the years that you've been gestating this are really evident in the wisdom that each of the stories is really saturated with. I'm curious about the sexiness of this book. It's a very sexy book. And in some places in the stories, there's this embodied erotics that feels like it's in tension with religion. And then in other spaces, the sexuality feels like an expression of the deepest spiritual truth. So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between erotics, and maybe queer erotics in particular, and Jewish mysticism?
Yeah, two things on that first, actually. So first, right, there's no one relationship, right? So that was another freedom of this form, right? Going back to your previous question, like different characters, different situations, different genders, different backgrounds, different spiritualities approach these kinds of, even if it's like the same tensions, that they're approaching it in totally different ways, and they're resolved in different ways. And that just felt more truthful than like, again, here's how I did it, right? It's like, here are, possibly 10 different ways in which those kind of tensions can resolve or not, or, can be expressed. And some of the characters do remain in their boxes, I guess, or do remain trapped in some way. And others don't. Yeah, it's funny, I remember thinking about this book a number of years ago and being like, well, I can never publish this book because it's way too racy, and then I won't have my CNN credibility anymore. And then yesterday I was on CNN and my producer was like, oh, I really want to read the book. And I was like, actually, you don't need to read the book. But it does feel like a kind of coming out in a certain way to have this out there. It's a big, there's so much in here. Like, I love my previous books. Like, I'm definitely not disowning any of them. When I chose to write God versus Gay, like, I wanted to write a sort of mainstream activist book for what was on a certain kind of political or liberation agenda at that time, which was 2011, right? Which is a long time ago in certain ways. And there was like the weird, earthy, pagany, psychedelic, erotic, queer parts just didn't really fit in that program. And it wasn't like it was censored. It was just like, to say this thing, I didn't say that thing, and now I'm saying that thing. So I was kind of like, I'd kind of come to peace with it during the editing process with Moriel, who's there in the in the Iron Press window, who really shepherded this project through a really important period and contributed so much to it. And I was like, okay, now it's cool. And now that it's out, I'm like nervous as hell again. Like, oh my God, all of the people on this Zoom call are going to read like the sex scenes, but like, go for it, read the sex scenes. I just think, for me, there's like, that's part of, there's no resolution for like exactly what the title refers to, but part of it, and it's in the epigraph, is this link between the spiritual and the sexual. and what that linkage is, if it's a homology or a metaphor, or if it's the same thing. In one story, a character says that religion isn't sublimated sex, sex is sublimated religion. And I've kind of felt that way in a lot of my own work. And that's kind of, yeah, that was one of those. That's, again, like there's no one way in which those two whatever it is, aspects of the human condition like interrelate. But for me, it's bizarre when I see some text or something which is like that they don't relate, or that one has to be stopped in order for the other to be opened. That just like seems to come from another planet relative to my experience.
There's something really touching about the vulnerability I hear you expressing about putting this out there. I feel like in the world of erotica, there's sort of this jaded like quality, and there's something so electric about being in this true nakedness of putting out these ideas that can feel so vulnerable, and that really comes through in the stories in a very arresting way. And I love that it is so sexy, and I also love that it's fiction, because in both those qualities it really takes its place in our canonical library of Judaic mysticism, which is filled with these mythological, fictional kind of stories, and also super erotic. So for me, it felt very much in conversation with our ancestors in a really exciting way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like that's definitely part of what's going on for me in here. You know, it's like the reaffirmation of the Zoharic eroticism that didn't see these drives as opposed, but saw them as closely related. And it's so challenging, I mean, because I did, but a lot of other folks, I've written a few scholarly articles on like, where's the queer fertilities in the Kabbalah. And it's always like a push-pull, right? So like, there's a lot of really liberating aspects in this sort of mystical eros. And yet it's so within its context, right? It's like, it's gender binary, it's heteronormative, it's not feminist and primarily, right? It's often really misogynistic. It does have a certain erotic economy in which things have to go and align in just such a way so that the entire universe doesn't collapse, literally. And so it's like, and yet there's this core truth in this mystical writing that there's something about Sitrei Arayot and Maseh Breshit and Maseh Merkava. There's something about these different the eros of the universe that's real. And so it's almost like a dream. This fiction is like a dream of what the Kabbalah would be like if it weren't patriarchal, if it had, and I think, the one that you're writing is that, right? It's like, what's the 21st and 22nd century pan everything Jewishly rooted, earthy, embodied mysticism that we haven't written yet. And that actually, funny, that's like the end of that story excerpt. We don't know what the sound of Gavriel Elah's trumpet is yet. We've just begun in the last few decades, like the day before yesterday, like we've just begun to hear that sound because it hasn't been shut down by the shutdowners.
And it's so thrilling because in the Jewish tradition, we have this idea that every mystic, no matter how exalted their contact with the divine is looking at the divine through their own window, which has its schmutz, its dirt, its scratches. And there's something really beautiful about taking the clarity of the window you have as somebody who is a feminist, who has the view on the world and has traveled through the world in the way you have, and looking at the divine without some of that schmutz that our ancestors had. And I also, you're very clearly in conversation with some ancestors who are also trying to grapple with that schmutz and scratches of patriarchy, the Sabbatians. There's some really explicit references to Sabbatianism in this book, and then some Easter eggs as well. And you also, of course, your previous book, The Heresy of Jacob Frank, you've been in this arena for a while. And I'm curious, do you think that Sabbatianism is particularly relevant in this moment? Is there something about Sabbatianism that it just feels like it's speaking to where we are now?
That's so provocative. I think I noticed that I keep answering your previous questions as you do the new one, but I think that's another reason why fiction was liberatory here. The Jacob Frank book was a scholarly book, right? And I wanted to get the story right, the non-fictional story right, which is ironic because Jacob Frank himself just lied constantly and made up stories all the time. But I wanted to get that lying right, honestly. And Yet I think a lot of the energy in this book is like exploring the unexplored avenues that remain from the movement of Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank, which for folks who don't know is sort of a mass messianic movement in the 17th century and then continuing through the 18th century, which really for the first time in European Jewish history really or the concept of sexual liberation as being related to redemption, either messianic redemption experienced experientially, individually, or even in the original Sabbatean movement collectively. That there was something about this, there were roots of this in the Zohar and even in other Kabbalistic texts, but really exploring what a community would look like when more people's voices were able to shape that community. And they were, it's hard to tease out, as you and I have talked about, what's the truth of the movement from what the heresiologists, their persecutors, had to say about it. For them, the idea that this was a movement of loose sexual morality, quote unquote, that was a charge, right? That was a calumny. For us, that might be really provocative and interesting. Like, tell me more about that. I don't know if that movement, I think there is something, I make an argument in the last chapter of the Jacob Frank book that the lineage of this sort of sublimated erotic mysticism is now so commonplace that we take it for granted. So Hasidic or neo-Hasidic melodies in a mainstream synagogue on a Friday night, for example. But that has a history, right? And that has a history to early Hasidism, and early Hasidism has a debt to Sabbateanism. And so there is something, I think, that's real about the resurgence in what we now call maybe spirituality, but which in the 17th century or 18th century might have been understood as enacting the messianic age through sexuality. And I would add, like, a lot of the shadow as well, right? There were obviously massive power abuses in these communities, starting with Jacob Frank himself. And we see that also. And in an age in which some of the boundaries that have constrained human behavior for a while are shifting, yeah, there is something, both the light and the shadow, that might be liberating, and also, again, sort of repeating power structures in that linkage, maybe.
Yeah, and because you've made it fiction and you have characters living out these Sabbatean ideas, playing with them in very real ways, is this book a call to action?
Oh, I don't know. I love when I get a question that I've literally never thought about. One thing, that comes to mind around that, one of the stories, there's an earlier version, this is a story called the Mikva of Ben Sira's Transmigration, which was previously titled The Erotic Mikva and was published in an online magazine called Ashe, a journal of experimental spirituality. And periodically, like every couple of months, I would get an email. That story tells the story of a closeted gay man in Jerusalem who goes to the mikvah, the ritual bath, every Friday to both like express and repress his sexuality. It's like a moment of nakedness and connection in a certain way, but also of repentance and shame and repression for him. And so it's kind of a dark story. I mean, it has a twist, which I won't spoil, but there's, he's struggling. That character is really struggling. And I would get these emails every couple of months, because it's written in first person, from people saying, thank you for telling your story. That's my story. Like, that's me. Like, they saw themselves in this character, not seeing that it was a fictional character, but thinking that it was me, which thank God it was not. It was based, there was a time when I was closeted and living in Jerusalem and going to the mikveh, and it was based on that experience, but not in the kind of way that it's depicted in the story. So on the one hand, right, fictional characters, but it was a compliment that I was able to render that character so convincingly that somebody thought it was a memoir, like that this was actually a true story. I think you're the call to action person more than I am. I don't know. I think there's a freedom in this form that in my nonfiction is not present. Again, I love my nonfiction work, and who knows what the next book will be, but and it's almost like the call to action is in the imagination. Roger Kamenetz, who gave a really kind blurb to the book and is a friend, it really keeps wanting to encourage like imagination as this font of divinity and of prophecy within us. And I think maybe that's where that call to action is for me on that, whatever one of the four worlds that is.
Very interesting. I'm realizing as I'm hearing your answer, that was kind of a leading question because I think the answer is yes, it's a call to action. I think for sure. I think one of the beauties of this being fiction is that it shows us how people could live out these ideas and not in a totally Pollyanna way. Like you've really rendered the tensions and the stress and the shadows and the conflict. And it's exciting. I think so many people are at spiritual crossroads and not sure how to live out a spiritual identity or a Jewish identity. And in a way, seeing somebody embody some of these ideas rather than reading about them in essayistic form is really compelling. But I'm hearing that's really some amount of that is my read over you.
No, I'm into it. I mean, I don't, what was it, 2 books ago was kind of a collection of memoirish essays that I'd written. It's a book called Enlightenment by Trial and Error. And there, I think, you know, at that phase of my work, there was this idea of like, this is a Judaism. Here's a new expression of Jewish something that can be built upon or can be like you said, maybe call to action. But I don't know. It feels like I love, it's not that that's not interesting. It's just like, I love this other position where it's creating this just zone of infinite possibility that fiction allows.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so good. There's nothing didactic about this, right? I'm able to read my own personal agenda into it. I can imagine another reader with their own perspective, you know, reading in this imaginative open-endedness what their heart is really looking for.
Thanks.
And I'm curious, we talked a little about Sabbatianism, so let's swing all the way to the most conservative side of the spectrum. You talked about the diversity of characters, but there is one theme that shows up a lot, that a lot of your characters come from ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox backgrounds. Can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Yeah, I feel like there's a heightened tension. I feel like I'm a little bit preaching to the former choir here, having this conversation with you, but you know, there's like an intensification of some of those tensions that's present in more traditional environments. And that's even true, not just on the sort of tense, difficult shadow struggle side, but even in the, you know, there's an intensification of spirituality, for example, in traditional Hasidic communities, that's often a challenge to replicate in progressive communities. I remember even when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, right, it was like I wanted to daven, I wanted to like pray in the Orthodox minyan, because that was like where the better vibe was, right? But that wasn't my politics and that wasn't my, you know, just where I wanted to be. And it was like that struggle, God, that's like I think it's 87 years ago that I was an undergraduate at Columbia. And it's still, you know, so that's still there. And so I do think that it's not like a difference in kind, but there's a difference in degree of intensification of the religious life that is present, I think, in traditional communities that heightens some of those tensions that we might also experience, but in a kind of less dramatic or less compelling way. But I was also, nervous again about like not messing up the renderings of these lives, and I benefited a lot. My favorite was at the kind of the very end, actually. Abby Chavestein was able to look at this, and actually I had named a character inadvertently over not just an actual Hasidic Rebbe, but like one of the founders of like this, you know, like Skver Hasidim, Hasidic dynasty was like happened to have the name of this, and then I changed that character's name, but just like in both in the detail and in the kind of there's something, the sharpness of that. And I think there's a little bit of projection for me also going on. Like these are projections of what would my life have been had I taken that path. And there was a time in my life, like much earlier, you know, 30 years ago, when there was a temptation to that, like there was an allure to that. And like, you know, I also thought about being a monk too. So I get around.
Can I put you on the spot? Can you read us a little bit from one of the stories where you really capture some of the grappling within that ultra-Orthodox context?
Yeah, that is definitely on the spot. So I'll do the intro to this just as a really short piece from the Sabbatian of Central Park. So this is narrated by a 19-year-old Chabad kid who is, we don't find out until the second half of the story what happened, but I'll just do like the first maybe 2 paragraphs or something where he sets out his confession. If I confess these things to you, Rebbe, I worry that you'll think I'm mamish fallen into the realm of the klippos, that my Yetzer Hara has taken control entirely of me. But you know everything already, Rebbe. You hear everything. You see everyone. So already you know what I'm going to say. I beg you, if there's any place in your heart, Rebbe, where you can find Rachmanis for me for what I did and who I am, then please can you set me back on a path to Hashem, because that is what I want more than anything. As you said yourself when you were still on this level, I mean, the human world, the gates of tshuva are always open. It's our special gift, the gift of returning to Hashem, and it's what I want more than anything. I'm only 19, Rebbe, so I know there's time to change, maybe, God willing, and you can help me, maybe, or maybe, I don't know, I know Rabbi Nachman recommended saying Tehillim for this problem, but I'm not attracted to women. I'm not saying chas v'shalom that I'm one of those people who march in the parades as if they're proud of their perversion. But now with some of the other Bacharim at the yeshiva meeting possible shidduchim, it disgusts me. It makes me mamash physically sick to think of it. It's horrible, I know, because Pru U'Revu is one of the most important mitzvahs, and we should always find some part of ourselves that loves God enough to triumph over the Yetzer Hara. And it's a zechus, really, to have this special burden that Hashem has blessed us with, to see if we're worthy. But that is what I have to tell you about. The time I understood the ikar of this problem, this question of the Yetzer Hara and what it is.
Thank you for that. I have never been a Lubavitch, this boy, but I've lived life adjacent to some of them, and that felt really resonant and authentic to me, and yeah, very revealing and resonant, I think, just as a human being. We're going to go to audience questions in a minute, but I just wanted to leave with the last question. So one of the central themes of the book is the idea that God is everything, God is one. And you end the book, kind of spoiler alert, can I go there? You end the book, you end the book in the last story with a character who's a child asking, hearing this idea that everything is God, and then asking their father, but what about the bad things? Are those also God? And what you have the father say to the child or respond is, you say, the father was silent because this question could not yet be answered for the boy. And instead, the father just sort of envelops the boy in this love, and the child is able to feel this enormous love. And I guess I'm curious, the question could not be answered for the boy. Could it be answered for us? Do you have thoughts about that? Or is it the wrong question? Do we only have the ability to just turn to the divine parental love and be enveloped with that? How do you think about where this question takes us?
Yeah, I think there's, thank you for that incredibly challenging last question. I think there's, that story in particular is a lot about questioning that everything is God teaching, which, that was a title of a book of mine, and the gap between that teaching and its lived reality. It's like one of those nice things that it's like it fits sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. And, obviously, I think probably everybody Jewish or Jewish adjacent has been, we've had a very difficult couple of months, to put it extremely understated. And I think I'm interested more now in the gap between that teaching and our reality rather than in the teaching. I don't know that there's an answer. There are facile answers that are provided, so we can look that up. But then there's like the gap between that facile answer and our lived experience of evil or of suffering. What I love about that too is that it's this little kid, right? We follow this character through his life where he's in his 20s, but he already kind of saw that there was a problem. So he goes in the beginning of that story. This is set in the 19th century, and he's kind of repeating this teaching over and over again, but he's already aware that it's not actually connecting. It's not his lived experience. And I think the revelation, the real spoiler alert, is like he gets a completely different revelation. That's not the sort of everything is God monism of a sort of, I don't want to gender it, but let's just call it a sort of traditional, I guess I'll gender it, a patriarchal conception of like what everything is. Like it's this transcendence and a leaving behind, but it's a much more polytheistic, earthy revelation that connects. And he sees that what he's really loving, there's that like myth about like gay guys are just like, it's like the distant father complex. And like he's yearning for that connection that he had with this loving moment with his father. But it was already complexified, right, by his awareness that like even this answer doesn't quite have it, or it doesn't have the truth on a deep kind of embodied level. And I don't have an answer to that either. On the relative plane, if there is a relative and absolute, if that is another dichotomy that maybe has some value or not, there's good and evil, and there's evil and there's suffering, and that we don't get away from that reality just by sort of saying, oh no, I'm in the absolute, in which suffering and non-suffering are all the same, like the Heart Sutra says, and there's no suffering and no liberation. Maybe from some point of view, which the Hasidim might call the God's point of view, but we don't inhabit that point of view. We inhabit, most of the time, we inhabit this human point of view. And that's as close to an answer as I have.
It's very beautiful. And I think there's something about the sort of unflinching willingness you have to sit with that complexity, to avoid the facile answer, and to really stay in the place of embodiment, which is where we live our lives. That makes this book so incredibly compelling and makes the spirituality of this book feel so real, because it's really playing out on the level of the body, on the level of the very messy human being.
Thanks. I love that it's another dichotomy questioned, like the secret that's not a secret, the secret that's revealed is the unreal that's the real, right? So it's the fiction, but it's the real. Yeah.
Okay. Questions from the audience.
Half of my teachers and friends are in this audience. So hi, everybody. I wish I could say hi to everyone directly in the chat. Hi, thanks for coming.
Can you talk about the mapping of the stories across the Sefirot? How did you identify these placements? Did the process of choosing which story fit within a given Sefirah change the form of the stories? Did it change how you thought about the Sefirot themselves?
I love that question. I'm looking at Moriel's face in his window, but he's keeping it really blank right now because he was in the nitty gritty of that. It's like, well, I really want this story to move here, but it's just not chesed, it's gevura, and we're stuck with this structure. And it was more like the flow, where that push-pull was in the flow of the book, right? Here are these 10 tales, and what's the flow that I wanted to have. But there's just no way. Secrets of Nakedness is Tiferet. That's just what it is. It's not moving. There's just things were assigned in there. So again, just not assuming everyone knows, these are these 10 aspects or emanations or qualities, both of the divine and the human, and they're both embodied and non-embodied qualities. You can see where I got this title from, right? Everything is always is and isn't. My favorite line in the Zohar is the light broke through and did not break through. This is the description of the creation of the universe. In the Zohar. So right, it was the mapping onto that structure. It actually gave me a kind of answer key. In the earliest versions of this, that structure wasn't here. And it was well, what is the structure? And there was a surrender to this flow, I think, that structure represents. Structure is even a weird word for it. It's yeah, it's something more dynamic than structure. It's it's this flow, right? And the flow of the shefa, this divine flow, through these different channels. And there was something liberating in the surrender to that. And I think, if it was really linear, I hope that when folks read it, it doesn't feel like a linear exposition of the Sefirot. I definitely don't think it feels that way. I definitely didn't write it that way. I mean, again, if someone reads it that way, that's great. But because that for me is I didn't feel like it was a coloring book, like a paint by numbers Sefirot coloring book. It was these different prisms of the refraction of the divine light, or the divine/sexual light, that I was really interested in. And the Sefirot are, it's the simple version, again, it's this chart, right? But these Sefirot are constantly changing. They're changing aspects. They are changing genders. They're changing, receiving, activating roles. And just the wildness of this seemingly, I guess for Kabbalah people, it could be a familiar structure, but it's so mystifying. The deeper you get into it, it's the opposite. Usually the deeper you get into something, the more you understand it. And here I feel the deeper you get in, the less you can comprehend or understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you just referenced some of the Kabbalistic imagery and topology and the pieces of what makes up the Jewish mystical tradition. I'm curious, your book is packed filled with this imagery. And one of the questions we have from the audience is, what is your favorite Kabbalistic insight or image in the book? Can you pick one?
Oof. Wow, that's another one I have never thought of. That's great. First of all, this feels like a great opportunity to thank Panina and everybody else at Ayin who labored over the manuscript of doing this. So we have like, not only do we have a glossary at the end with like 1,000 Hebrew and Yiddish terms, but we like invented a new form of footnotes to like put some of the terms on the page itself, so you don't have to flip back and forth. And I know that like had a lot of manual labor involved in making that happen. And just in general, you know, Ayin has been like so terrific to work with on this project, and I'm just super grateful for all of that. I think what I'm doing is stalling answering the question. I think, you know, there's a rejection. There's a certain Kabbalistic character who comes in who, you know, I'll say, oh, it is being recorded. It's after a particular Chabad affiliated Jewish mystic who's well known, who shares a name with a Supreme Court justice, but a different spelling. And that feels like enough of a remez for Hamevin Yavin. Those who understand can understand. And that character sort of appears and is like, and slaps down this this Hasidic character in the 10th story. Like, you think your experience has anything to do with God. God is totally transcendent. It has nothing to do with anything you. And I love the rejection of that, right? So he receives this rebuke from this Kabbalist, and then, you know, in the rest of the story, that's just totally undone. And that is sort of a perverse way of answering that question, because I just sort of did the least favorite teaching and how it's rejected, but it's partly rejected through Sabbatean Kabbalah, right? Those are some of the Easter eggs that those characters in the last story are named after various figures in the Sabbatean movement. And they kind of give over this heretical teaching that this is the redeemed reality, and this body and this experience, and the secret is that there is no secret, that that is the secret, that it's not the secret. And that's the shocking secret. And some see that as an atheist secret, which is one way to see it, and some see it as a kind of magic polytheistic secret or an earthy secret. But either way, it's not a secret. And I think it's that interplay, the Shemaim Aretz interplay, and a normative Hasidic. In fact, the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote a number of things about this, that the lowest is the highest, which is itself, again, has a clear debt to Sabbateanism, but for him, it's also it's the extension of the Ein Sof, of the infinite, in precisely the places where it seems not to be, that is the highest. So that's why how the lowest is the highest. That teaching shows up in the Sabbatean of Central Park story, which I read just the very beginning of just now. And that is a truly radical statement in a traditional normative conservative form, that I just love that's the real Easter egg, right? When you're reading something that the Lubavitcher Rebbe spoke or wrote, and there's this deeply heretical Torah in there, that's the cool Easter egg.
Yeah, it feels like it comes up a lot, especially in some of the first Hasidic masters. You read their writings and they go so close to the edge of being totally radical, but they're not willing to take that last step. And it feels like in your stories, you take us to where they were, and then you take that next step.
And that's what I did in my work. You know, I went to get my PhD in Chassidut, in Hasidism, and was looking at some really radical Hasidic theology. But just as you said, they get to there and then back to Torah and mitzvahs. And with Jacob Frank, for all of his very deep and irredeemable faults, he was constantly surprising. And that was just irresistible for me as a scholar, and then as a writer.
That really comes through. Question in the audience: would you talk a little more about the celebration / pride - shame flip-flop you felt releasing the book? Any tactics that have helped you deal with that?
What was the last part? That flip-flop that I felt what?
Releasing the book.
Releasing the book. Oh man, I haven't dealt with it at all. I'm just waiting for the blowback. I don't know. That's when Eden said it's a new chapter in my work, I was reaching for the Xanax. I was like, shit, he's right. It is sort of a new chapter. But that's exciting, I'm like a suburban dad, so to have a new chapter that's edgy and exciting feels really good. It's a good balance. I know we've both got, kids at home and stuff, and that that there still can be that edge. I mean, that's part of the psychedelic stuff too for me, like that there still is this growing edge is actually really exciting. So I don't know. I mean, I think, look, the teaching is going to be what it's going to be. And I'm old enough now where, yeah, so I'll just share what Shir's wife put in the private chat to me. It was a new chapter. She wrote in chapter 11, like bankruptcy chapter. Hopefully that's not true. Eden thinks the book's going to sell really well. I just feel like, there's an integrated teaching that's here. And one of the teachings, which may or may not have been said by the Ishbitzer Rebbe from Hasidut, is that depression or sadness is replaceability. The idea that, oh, that was Shir, not Emily. I was wondering why Emily was on this call, Shir. That was Shir who said chapter 11. Sadness is replaceability. I definitely do feel like I don't mean this, well, maybe I do mean it egotistically. I don't know anyone else who could have written this book. Like, this is the book that feels like the book that I can write. And that feels really redemptive, that there's just, this weird combination of these different aspects. And, Shir is correct about the chapter 11 thing. Like, there are more mainstream mass market books that are in my brain. And yet when it comes to the thing of like, what's going to be the next book, each time I make the wrong decision, which is to say the right decision, I think. And this was one of them. And Eden came to me, right? Because I pitched this to IAN before and they said, no, thanks. And then after I won the National Jewish Book Award, Eden was like, hey, Jay, what about that book you pitched? Let's talk more about that. And thank God, because I don't know if I would have ever had the chutzpah to move forward with this project.
And it's such a gift to us, such a gift to the world that you were willing to lean into that chutzpah, to willing to lean away from where the mass market is calling to give us.
That was the answer that is not an answer. Plus, now I've realized that I can abuse this title of this book all the time, right? It's like, I don't know, cheese. It's the meal that is not a meal, right? So I see infinite potential for sequels for IAN to put out.
Yeah, a whole series. I'm going to turn you back to Eden in a moment. I just want to thank you for the book and for being in conversation with me and for sharing what you did. As I was rereading your stories, I thought about what Franz Kafka famously said, that a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that feels true on the individual level, but it also feels true on the cultural level, that the Jewish people have been frozen over by so much trauma that's paralyzed us, that's calcified us. And this book feels like that diamond axe that can cut through and release some of that mayim chayim, those living waters.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Back to Eden.
Well, thank you so much, Jay and Jericho, for a really fantastic discussion. Thank you for taking us all those places and letting us join you. And I want to also say thank you to Shir for the beautiful music that you opened this evening with. If you haven't purchased a copy of Jay's book and would like to, the order link should be in the comments of the Zoom chat and is also featured on the website of IAN Press, which is AYINPRESS.org. And you can find it on the books page. We hope you have a wonderful evening and that you enjoyed our time together and look forward to connecting in the future. Thank you so much, Jay Michaelson, Jericho Vincent, Shir, Meira, Feit.
Thank you, Jericho. Thanks, everybody. Really so nice to see your friends in the Zoom, and my friends in the Zoom boxes. I'm sorry I didn't get to say hi to each of you. So I'm looking at you now. Thanks, everybody.